chapter 13, verse 11. And I saw another beast coming up from the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. The evangelist says that immediately after the vision of the first beast who ascended from the sea, which he described to us and helped with its analysis, he saw another beast coming up from the earth, not the sea. From the earth he had two horns, not 10, and they were the horns of a lamb. And he spoke like a dragon, like a snake. What is the meaning of this? What is the identity of this second new beast revealed to the apocalyptic horizon of the evangelist? We have a third person on board. The first was the dragon who persecuted the woman and her child, and the child ascended to heaven. The child, Jesus Christ. The dragon persecuted the woman who flees in the desert, and he spews rivers of water out of his mouth to drown her. He is the devil. The second person is the Antichrist, the beast which comes up from the sea. The third person is the beast which comes from the earth, and consequently, my friends, we have three persons. And what about this third person? Saint Aretha says he's also a man with the energy of Satan. So we are dealing with a man. The first person is not a man, but the devil, who does not have the ability to incarnate. It is impossible for the devil to take on flesh, to incarnate, to become human. He can appear as a man, but this is in terms of fantasy. An angel or a spirit can never incarnate ontologically. This is the exclusive privilege of the Creator, of Jesus Christ. No one else can succeed in this. Thus, the devil is not a man. The Antichrist, however, the second person, is a man. He is 100% human. He was speaking as a dragon. What does this mean? It means that he was a person ruled by the energy of Satan, or the powers of Satan were inside of him. This is expressed by the verse, he was speaking as a dragon, like he had the devil inside him. And he speaks like the dragon. In other words, he behaves with the characteristics of the devil. He appears with the horns of a lamb. The lamb is a peaceful animal, a gentle animal. Here he pretends to be a man of peace, a man of goodness. But in reality, my friends, he's a deceiver and a false prophet. He comes up from the earth. This is a sign, according to St. Andrew, a characteristic of his slithering polity. He's a dark person, a despicable person who introduces and carries dark ideas, as we'll see shortly. We often hear the term dark forces or dark powers, backstage forces. About the evil spirits rising from the earth, I will bring to your memory the spiritist session of King Saul with a sorceress, a female medium, and she was saying, I see the spirits coming up from the earth. These are demons, unclean spirits. This reality is expressed by coming up from the earth. It is an expression intending to show that this third person is a dark person. Yet on the outside, this person appears joyous, full of optimism and smiles. He promises freedom. He promises material abundance, peace, great social life. He promises ecumenicity, or one happy world community. And I already mentioned to you what these things are all about. He promises all these things. He's a great messenger, a bearer of wonderful messages. He has a nice appearance, but in reality he happens to be a very dark person. The overall view of this vision of the evangelist John perfectly agrees with the forewarnings of our Lord in Matthew 7:15. Be mindful of the false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. Exactly the same thing. The Lord said, be aware, be careful. They are wolves and not sheep. They are beasts. They are not harmless men. They are schemers of the underworld. They are scheming to devour you, to swallow you up, to lead you astray by the method of deception. They want to lead you to perdition. Be aware. Therefore, the presence of the third person complements and fulfills the work of the other two. The dragon, the beast Antichrist, number 2, and the beast false prophet, the third person. What is this threesome? This gruesome threesome will strive to provide a sorry imitation of the Holy Trinity. And as the Holy Trinity is worshipped by the faithful, this evil counterfeit Trinity will require to be worshipped in the place of the Holy Trinity. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast on his behalf and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. Verse 12. So this third beast has all the authority of the first beast, meaning the Antichrist, who took his authority from the dragon or devil. So we have this transfer of authority. So the position of the second beast is subservient to the first, and he acts according to the regulations and follows the very agenda of the first beast. So essentially, what is the second beast? A type of a forerunner. St. Andrew of Caesarea writes, he is to come before the Antichrist in order to prepare for him or open the road to perdition. So he stands before the Antichrist and he implements all the necessary propaganda to open the road of destruction for the Antichrist. Here once again we have a sad imitation of St. John the forerunner of Christ, who came before and opened and prepared the path of the Lord. And the false prophet opens the road for the coming of the Antichrist. In other words, we have a very bad imitation of the forerunner of Christ. Do you see why the blessed Augustine calls the Antichrist the monkey of Christ? What is the specific work of the false prophet? To promote the worship of the first beast. What is the purpose of the work of the false prophet? The purpose of the agenda of the false prophet is the worship of the first beast of the Antichrist. And through the Antichrist, the worship of the dragon, the devil. And in hopes to be successful in this, the false prophet performs signs and great wonders, as the next verse informs us. And of course, all these take place by God's permission, by the secondary or concessionary will of God. The main argument which will be used to motivate the worship of the Antichrist can be found in the sentence, and he makes the inhabitants of the earth worship the beast whose fatal wound had been healed. The pretense that the Antichrist resurrected from the dead. I was speaking on this last year. Or perhaps he resurrected one of his personal bodyguards who was fatally wounded. But this was staged and not ontological. It wasn't real, because the devil lacks this power. He cannot resurrect a dead person. He can stage it by using fantasy, imagery, and I explained to you last year the dimension of this fantasy and how is this possible, and I offered you a good example of this demonic ability to stage fantasies and phantoms. Consequently, all these means will serve to open the way of the worship of the Antichrist. The fame that he died and resurrected, or someone else died next to him and he resurrected him from the dead, and the masses will marvel and exclaim, what else are we waiting for? He's the Messiah. And by this underhanded method, the avenue will be open to worship the other beast, namely the Antichrist. But what is the relationship of these two beasts in terms of their activity? This is a very significant chapter, a great paragraph indeed. But since our time has run out, I don't want to open this subject today and not be able to finish it. You will be amazed to see how the Antichrist moves about and how the false prophet carries out his specific work. The Antichrist's work will reach certain sectors. As many as he cannot reach, the false prophet will succeed in completing. Thus, they use two different methodologies with the end result to deceive the people and to lead them to the worship of the Antichrist and the dragon, the devil. All these things, my friends, are not events of the very distant future. They are true for every age, for every season. This is certainly true for our days. The smart man who has the mind of Christ can certainly discern this. He can perceive it and act accordingly. I pray with all my heart for God to watch over you and to protect you from the worship of Satan. At the end of our last meeting, we left off at the point of examining the relationship between the two beasts, between the first beast, namely the Antichrist, and the second beast, the false prophet. The first beast is symbolized in the book of the Revelation with 10 horns, and the second beast is symbolized with 2 horns and the appearance of a ram. But what is the actual relationship between these two beasts, namely the Antichrist and the false prophet? I had mentioned to you that the false prophet is the forerunner of the Antichrist, a sort of an imitation of the forerunner of Christ, of St. John the Baptizer. The purpose of the coming of the false prophet is to open the way to prepare the road for the worship of the Antichrist and for the deification of Satan. This is what we were saying last week. However, there is one more point. You already know, based on the symbolism alone, that the Antichrist is coming as a powerful personality. 10 horns depict exactly this, because the horn in the scripture is always the symbol of might and power. So he's coming with a dynamic form, with a purpose to subdue and destroy the faithful and the weak and the cowardly. But this method is not always 100% successful. That's why he will also use another method, the method of deception, where he will show olive branches and promises of peace. This role will be played out by the false prophet. Consequently, he will also come with the appearance of the pacifist. This is symbolized by the 2 horns of the ram. He is coming as a sheep. These 2 tactics of Satan, the use of force and the use of deception, in other words, the method of peace, these 2 tactics are always at work throughout history. This is true for every century and every generation. I'm telling you this constantly, and I will continue to remind you. So don't think that these things will happen sometime in the very distant future, and they don't necessarily concern us or relate to our present situation. I will repeat one more time what St. John the Evangelist says. You heard that the Antichrist is coming, and now there are many Antichrists. Many Antichrists have come into the world. Consequently, the Antichrist is coming, but the Antichrists are already here, and the false prophet is coming, because he's also a person, as we were examining his identity last time. But many false prophets abound in our days. Thus, the mystery of lawlessness is continually at work during every season and every generation. Moreover, if you will, the dynamic format of the Antichrist is carried out in the area of authority, while the second format of the false prophet works through ideology. Did you hear? I underline as ideology, as heresy, always with a spiritual dimension. This is the work of the false prophet during every age, of course. The apostolic generation faced the Antichrist in the person of Nero, the executioner of Christians. The apostolic generation faced the false prophet in the heresy of the Nicolaitans. St. Paul writes about them without naming them, prophesying about them, but in reality they already existed. But more so, St. John the Evangelist writes about them in his epistles, and especially in the book of the Revelation, in a letter to the bishop of Ephesus and Thyatira and Pergamos, which were already analyzed, where Christ says that God hates the works of the Nicolaitans. The generation of St. Athanasios also recognized this dynamic form of the Antichrist in the person of Diocletian and the false prophet in the person of Arius. Later on, the Antichrist continued his work through Muhammad as a dynamic person of the Antichrist. Here I will bring to you the memory of Saint Cosmas the Aetolian. I believe you send in a question about this. Why does Saint Cosmas say that the Antichrist came? Because he sees the Antichrist in the person of Muhammad. These are the Antichrists who have come and will continue to come, and they are mainly forerunners of the Antichrist. So St. Cosmas the Aetolian sees the Antichrist in the person of Muhammad, not the founder of Islam, but his contemporary Muhammad, the conqueror or the destroyer, who was very successful in his expansionism, and he succeeded to wipe out many Christian lands by forcing them to become Muslims. His goal was to Islamize the world and obviously eradicate Christianity. This expansion movement of the Muslims at the time and the Arabs was quite successful in eradicating most of the Christian churches in northern Africa. This genocide of these Christian churches is most likely irreversible up until the second coming of Christ. Gone are those world-renowned super churches of Hippo and Chalcedon and many others of North Africa, which no longer exist today, and as I said, it is doubtful if these churches will ever exist again. Now, who would you say the false prophet may be? And this not only according to St. Cosmas the Aetolian, but we also see it and understand it along the same lines, even though it would seem that we are speaking with some fanaticism. The false prophet is the Pope, as I had already told you during one of our past topics. Yes, the Pope. But which Pope? The Western Christianity headed by the Pope, which brings forth delusion and heresy, namely the adulteration of Christianity with the purpose of the negation of people's salvation. In our days, the Antichrist is completing this work through the God-opposing and anti-Christian social systems, or even through nations which use systematic methods of church eradication, while the false prophet is busy at work with a multifarious heresies such as Chiliasm or ecumenism or whatever else is offered as heresy and adulteration of the Christian spirit.